Picture this: you walk into the most elite military training facility in America. Around you, stand the toughest, most battle-hardened warriors our nation has ever produced. Navy SEALs who've survived Hell Week, Rangers who've fought in the deadliest corners of the world, and Special Forces operators whose very presence commands respect. Then, someone new walks in. The room goes quiet. Not the respectful quiet reserved for legends, but the uncomfortable silence that comes before judgment. Whispers start in the corners. Smirks appear on pretty much weathered faces. Plus, someone mutters under their breath about diversity initiatives and lowered standards. They see what they expect to see: someone who doesn't belong. Someone who couldn't possibly understand what they've been through. Someone who hasn't, earned the right to stand among them. They sort of have no idea they're looking at someone who has been to hell and back 5 times over. Someone whose chest carries more combat decorations than most of them will ever see. Someone whose story will make their own battles seem like training exercises. In the next 60 minutes, everything they think they know about strength, courage, and what it means to be a warrior is about to be completely shattered. This is the true story of how the most elite soldiers in America learned that heroism comes in forms they never expected, and that sometimes the greatest warriors are the ones you'd never see coming. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete courtyard of the Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, California. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos stepped out of the olive green military transport vehicle, her boots hitting the pavement with the same measured precision that had carried her through 8 years of active combat duty. The September air was crisp, carrying the salt scent of the Pacific Ocean that lay just beyond the training compound's walls. At 28 years old, Maria stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulder-length dark hair pulled back in regulation style and brown eyes that held depths most people couldn't fathom. Her uniform was pristine, pressed to perfection, but it was what wasn't immediately visible that told her real story. Beneath the fabric, her body carried the evidence of battles fought in the mountains of Afghanistan and the deserts of Iraq: shrapnel scars, bullet wounds that had healed into raised white lines, and muscle memory of movements that had kept her alive when death came calling. The assignment that brought her here was classified at the highest levels. The Pentagon had handpicked 12 of the military's most experienced combat veterans for a joint task force designed to test new battlefield technologies and tactics. These weren't ordinary soldiers, they were the best of the best, drawn from every branch of special operations. Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Marine Force Recon, Air Force Pararescue, and Delta Force operators who had earned their reputations in the world's most dangerous places. Maria adjusted the strap of her gear bag and walked toward the main building. Through the windows, she could see figures moving inside: broad shoulders, crew cuts, and the unmistakable bearing of men who had spent their lives preparing for war. She had worked alongside soldiers like these before, fought beside them, bled with them. But she also knew that first impressions in this world were everything, and hers rarely went the way people expected. The double doors opened automatically as she approached. Inside, the building hummed with the quiet efficiency of a military installation. Polished floors reflected overhead lighting, and the walls were lined with photographs of previous SEAL classes, their faces young, determined, staring out from black and white memories of training that had forged them into something harder than steel. The main briefing room lay at the end of a long corridor. As Maria walked toward it, she passed smaller rooms where she could see groups of men checking equipment, studying maps, or engaged in the kind of casual conversation that soldiers use to size each other up. A few glances followed her progress, curious but not yet dismissive. That would come later. She paused outside the briefing room door, hearing voices from within. Through the small window, she could see them: 11 men arranged around a large conference table. They were exactly what she had expected. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of physical presence that came from years of pushing human limits. Their uniforms bore the insignia of America's most elite units, and their posture spoke of confidence earned through trials that broke lesser men. Maria checked her watch, which she was exactly on time, as she had been for every mission briefing, every deployment, every moment that mattered over the past 8 years. Punctuality was just pretty much one of many habits that had kept her alive when the margins for error disappeared entirely. She opened the door and stepped inside. The conversation stopped immediately. 11 pairs of eyes turned toward her, and, in that moment, she could read their thoughts as clearly as if they had spoken them aloud. The quick glances that took in her height, her build, her gender. The subtle shift in posture that spoke of judgments being formed before she had even introduced herself. The barely perceptible exchange of looks between men who thought they knew exactly what they were seeing. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, a SEAL with 15 years of experience, was the first to speak. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room. "You must be our final team member," he said, his tone polite but measured. "We were expecting someone from the Army's Special Operations community, lol." "That would be me," Maria replied, her voice steady and clear. She moved to the empty chair at the table, noting how the space seemed to contract around her presence. "Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, reporting as ordered." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but, in a room full of warriors, 3 seconds was enough to communicate volumes. She watched as the men processed this information, saw the moment when surprise gave way to something that looked uncomfortably like disappointment. Chief Petty Officer Rick Hayes, whose biceps strained against his uniform sleeves, leaned back in his chair with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Santos," he repeated, "and what unit are you coming from, Staff Sergeant?" "Most recently, the 75th Ranger Regiment," Maria answered, settling into her chair with the same calm she had maintained under enemy fire. Before that, various assignments with the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. The response was immediate and predictable. Rangers were respected, certainly, but, in a room full of Tier 1 operators, respect had to be earned through more than unit patches. She watched as Master Sergeant Tony Chan, a Delta Force operator with arms covered in intricate tattoos, exchanged a meaningful look with Gunnery Sergeant Dave Wilson from Force Recon. "Rangers," Wilson said, nodding slowly. "Good unit. Lot of solid infantry work." The emphasis on infantry was subtle but unmistakable, a gentle reminder that Rangers, while elite, weren't quite on the same level as the men seated around this table. Colonel James Mitchell entered the room before the conversation could develop further. Mitchell was a legend in special operations circles, a man whose career had spanned 3 decades and conflicts on 5 continents. His presence immediately commanded attention, and the informal atmosphere shifted to something more professional. "Gentlemen," Mitchell announced, then paused as his eyes found Maria. "And Sergeant Santos. Welcome to Operation Crossroads." He moved to the head of the table, carrying himself with the authority of someone who had earned his position through blood and sacrifice. "You 12 represent the finest special operations personnel this nation has to offer. Over the next 6 months, you'll be testing equipment, tactics, and technologies that will shape how America fights its wars for the next generation." He gestured to a large screen that descended from the ceiling. Images flashed across it: advanced weapons systems, communication devices, body armor that looked like something from science fiction. "The enemy is evolving," Mitchell continued. "Plus, TBH, their tactics, their technology, their willingness to target American interests anywhere in the world. We need to evolve faster." Maria watched the presentation with the same focused attention she had given to countless mission briefings over the years. But she was also aware of the subtle dynamics playing out around the table. The way Morrison kept glancing in her direction, as if trying to solve a puzzle. The whispered comment from Hayes to the man beside him that was too quiet to hear but easy enough to interpret from context. When the formal briefing concluded, Mitchell dismissed them with instructions to report to the equipment depot in 1 hour. As the group began to file out, Maria found herself walking beside Captain Alex Rodriguez, an Air Force pararescueman whose quiet demeanor set him apart from some of the more vocal members of the team. "Hell of a thing," Rodriguez said conversationally as they moved through the corridor. 6 months of testing the newest toys the Pentagon can dream up. "Should be interesting." Maria nodded. "It's an honor to be selected," she replied. It was the kind of response that committed to nothing while maintaining professionalism, another skill learned through years of navigating military hierarchies where words carried weight far beyond their surface meaning. Behind them, she could hear the voices of the others, already forming the bonds that would define this team's dynamics. Morrison was discussing the morning's physical training schedule with Wilson. Chen was questioning Hayes about some piece of equipment they'd be testing. Normal conversation for soldiers preparing for an extended assignment together. But Maria caught the undercurrent too, the subtle skepticism that followed her like a shadow. She had dealt with it before, in ranger school, in combat units, in every assignment where her presence challenged expectations. The doubt wasn't anything new, and neither was her response to it. She would do her job, do it better than anyone expected, and let her performance speak louder than any words could. They didn't know. What they couldn't know from looking at her was that her performance had already spoken volumes in places where talk was cheap and results were measured in lives saved and missions accomplished. In the mountains of Afghanistan, she had carried wounded teammates to safety while under heavy fire. In the streets of Baghdad, she had led raids that captured high-value targets without losing a single soldier under her command. In classified operations that would never appear in official records, she had made decisions that altered the course of battles and saved American lives. The Purple Hearts weren't just decorations. They were testament to a warrior's journey that had taken her to the edge of death 5 separate times, and each time she had refused to stay down. The bronze stars with V devices for valor told stories of actions that most soldiers would never need to take. The Silver Star, her highest decoration for gallantry in combat, represented a single afternoon in Helmand province where her choices had meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But none of that was visible as she walked through the corridors of the Naval Special Warfare Command. What these men saw was what everyone saw first: someone who didn't fit their preconceived notions of what a warrior should look like. Someone whose presence in their elite circle raised questions about standards and qualifications. They had no idea that within hours, those questions would be answered in ways that would reshape their understanding of courage, skill, and what it truly meant to be tested in the crucible of combat. The morning's polite skepticism was about to collide with an afternoon that would reveal just how dangerous it could be to judge a warrior by anything other than their actions under fire. As they approached the equipment depot, Maria allowed herself a small smile. She had been underestimated before, and she had learned to use that underestimation as a weapon more powerful than anything in the military's arsenal. Today would be no different. Today would be the beginning of an education for some of the most elite soldiers in America, taught by someone they never saw coming. The equipment depot stretched across 3 aircraft hangars, each one filled with the kind of military hardware that existed, only in the imagination of defense contractors and the nightmares of America's enemies. Maria moved through the organized chaos alongside her 11 teammates, each of them assigned to test different systems that would eventually find their way to special operations units around the world. The first 2 hours passed without incident. They tested communication devices that could punch signals through mountains and coordinate between units separated by hundreds of miles. They evaluated body armor that could stop rifle rounds while weighing less than a standard tactical vest. They examined weapons systems that integrated advanced optics with computer-assisted targeting, turning every soldier into a precision marksman. Maria approached each piece of equipment with the methodical thoroughness that had kept her alive through dozens of combat operations. She asked technical questions that highlight deep understanding of battlefield applications. She identified potential failure points that the engineers had missed. She suggested modifications based on real-world experience that impressed even the civilian contractors running the demonstrations. But she was also watching her teammates, reading the group dynamics that would determine how effectively they could work together over the coming months. Morrison had emerged as the unofficial leader, his SEAL background and natural authority making him the focal point around which others organized. Hayes and Wilson had bonded over shared experiences in force recon operations, their easy camaraderie evident in how they moved through the equipment stations together. Chen remained somewhat aloof, his Delta Force background creating a natural barrier that others respected but didn't challenge. Rodriguez continued his quiet professionalism, asking insightful questions and taking detailed notes that suggested he understood the broader implications of what they were testing. The remaining team members had sorted themselves into a hierarchy based on unit reputation, deployment history, and the subtle pecking order that existed within the special operations community. And, at the bottom of that hierarchy, through no fault of her own actions but simply by virtue of being different, sat Maria Santos. The shift began during lunch break. The team had gathered in a small dining facility adjacent to the depot, sharing field rations and the kind of shop talk that soldiers use to establish credentials and build rapport. Stories emerged about, for what it's worth, difficult deployments, close calls with enemy forces, and the kind of gallows humor that helped warriors process experiences too intense for civilian comprehension. Maria listened more than she spoke, a habit developed over years of being the outsider in groups like this one. When she did contribute to the conversation, her comments were precise and relevant, demonstrating knowledge that came from direct experience rather than second-hand accounts. But she could feel the subtle distance that others maintained, the way conversations shifted when she joined them, the questions that weren't quite asked directly. It was Hayes who finally voiced what several others were thinking. "Santos," he said during a lull in conversation, "I have to ask, how does someone from the Rangers end up in a group like this? I mean, no disrespect to the Rangers, but this is supposed to be the top 1% of the top 1%. The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Maria set down her water bottle and met Hayes' gaze directly. "The same way everyone else does," she replied evenly. "Someone higher up the chain decided I belonged here." "But, specifically," Wilson pressed, leaning forward, with the kind of intensity that suggested he had been wondering about this since morning. "What's your operational background, and how many deployments? What kind of TBH missions?" Maria recognized the moment for what it was, not malicious, exactly, but a test designed to establish her place in the group's hierarchy. She had faced similar challenges before, and experience had taught her that how she handled the next few minutes would determine how the team treated her for months to come. 6 deployments, she said simply: Afghanistan, Iraq, and some places that aren't on the official record. Variety of missions: direct action, reconnaissance, personnel recovery, target interdiction. Personnel recovery, Morrison repeated, his tone as suggesting that term covered everything from evacuating wounded soldiers to extracting captured pilots. "That's broad kind of, what specifically?" Maria paused, calculating how much she could say without violating security classifications. "Afghanistan, 2018. Our team was tasked with recovering a downed helicopter crew in hostile territory. The operation lasted 18 hours and required movement through enemy-controlled terrain under constant threat of attack." She could see the interest in their eyes now, the way soldiers leaned forward when real war stories began. This was currency they all understood, the shared experience that created bonds stronger than blood between people who had faced death together. "How many crew members?" Chen asked, his first real contribution to the conversation. 4, Maria replied, to be fair, 2 wounded, 1 critically. "We had to carry them 12 miles to the extraction point while being pursued by Taliban fighters who knew the terrain better than we did." "And?" Hayes prompted when she didn't continue. "And we brought them all home," Maria finished quietly. The silence that pretty much followed was different from the morning's skeptical pause. This was the silence of soldiers who understood what those simple words represented: the weight of responsibility, the physical demands of carrying wounded teammates across impossible terrain, the mental strength required to keep moving when every instinct screamed for rest. Rodriguez broke the silence. 18 hours, he said. "That's a long time to stay ahead of pursuit in that kind of country." Maria nodded. "The longest night of my life," she admitted. "But not the worst." So yeah, before anyone could ask what she meant by that, an alarm sounded throughout the facility. Not the sharp blast of an emergency signal, but the steady tone that indicated a scheduled drill or exercise. Colonel Mitchell's voice came over the intercom system, crisp and authoritative. "All personnel to the main training area immediately. We have an unscheduled evaluation exercise. Full gear, weapons condition yellow, movement in 30 seconds. The transformation was immediate. Conversation stopped, to be fair, mid-sentence, as 12 elite soldiers shifted into combat mode. They, for what it's worth, moved with the fluid efficiency of people who had performed similar transitions thousands of times, grabbing equipment, checking weapons, and falling into tactical formation without conscious thought. Maria found herself near the rear of the group as they moved toward the training area, a position that reflected her status as the unknown quantity in the team's dynamics. She didn't mind. She had learned long ago that proving herself was a process measured in actions rather than words, and she suspected that opportunity was about to present itself. The training area occupied several acres of carefully designed terrain that could simulate everything from urban environments to mountainous regions. Today, it had been configured to resemble a Middle Eastern village, complete with mud brick buildings, narrow alleyways, and the kind of complex layout that had challenged American forces for 2 decades of irregular warfare. Mitchell stood at the entrance to the mock village, flanked by a team of observers carrying evaluation clipboards and cameras. His expression was serious, the look of a commander who was about to test his people in ways that would reveal their true capabilities. "Gentlemen," he announced, then caught himself. "Well, team members. You have 40 minutes to clear this village of hostile forces and recover critical intelligence that our enemy is attempting to destroy." The opposition force consists of 12 experienced military personnel who know this terrain intimately and have been given significant advantages in positioning and equipment. He gestured toward the village. "There are civilians present, role players who must not be harmed. There are booby traps and improvised explosive devices that can eliminate you from the exercise instantly. There are sniper positions that cover all major approaches. And there is a time limit that cannot be extended under any circumstances." Maria checked her weapon automatically, muscle memory ensuring that everything was ready for immediate use. Around her, the other team members were conducting similar preparations, but she could sense something different in their approach. This wasn't just another training exercise, this was an evaluation that would determine how they worked together as a unit, and everyone understood that individual performance would be measured against team success. "One more thing," Mitchell added, his voice carrying a note that made everyone pay closer attention. "The opposition force has been briefed on your backgrounds, your typical tactics, and your individual strengths and weaknesses. They know how SEALs operate, how Rangers approach problems, how Delta Force conducts direct action missions. They have prepared specifically to counter everything they think you'll do." Real talk. He stepped back and checked his watch. "Clock starts now." The team moved forward as a unit, but Maria could immediately see the challenges they faced. Morrison naturally assumed tactical command, his SEAL training making him the logical choice for coordinating a complex operation. But the other team members came from units with different operational philosophies, different approaches to problem solving, and different ideas about how to achieve the mission objectives. The first sniper engagement came within minutes. Plus, Hayes, who had taken point position, suddenly dropped to one knee and signaled contact to the rear. The sharp crack of simulated gunfire echoed across the training area, followed by the electronic beep that indicated a training casualty. "Hayes is down," Morrison announced over the team radio. "Sniper position, 11 o'clock, approximately 200 meters." The team took cover behind a low wall that bordered the village, but Maria could see the problem immediately. They were thinking like the individual units they had come from rather than adapting to the specific challenges of this terrain and this mission. The opposition force had positioned the sniper to channel them toward a predictable response, and they were walking directly into the trap. "Morrison, she said quietly over the radio, that sniper position is bait. They want us to focus on it while they maneuver other assets into position." Morrison's response was sharp. "Santos, maintain radio discipline, which I'll coordinate counter-sniper operations." Maria watched as Wilson and Chen began moving to flank the sniper position, their movement exactly what any special operations team would attempt in similar circumstances. It, I think, was also exactly what the opposition force was expecting. She could see the signs, subtle indicators in the terrain that suggested prepared positions, the way certain approaches were left conspicuously open, the timing of the initial engagement that had been designed to provoke a specific response. The second casualty came 30 seconds later. Wilson's voice crackled over the radio, professional despite the frustration. "Contact right, multiple hostiles. Chin is down, I'm pinned behind the blue building." Morrison cursed quietly. 2 men down in less than 5 minutes, and they hadn't even entered the main part of the village yet. At this rate, they'd fail the exercise before they had a chance to locate the intelligence they were supposed to recover. Santos, Rodriguez, Morrison commanded, moved to support Wilson. Everyone else, we're going to suppress that sniper position and advance through the center. Maria keyed her radio. Morrison, that's not going to work. They're herding us into a kill zone. The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds, an eternity in tactical operations. When Morrison responded, his voice carried the edge of a leader whose authority was being questioned at the worst possible moment. Santos, follow orders. Move to support Wilson immediately. Maria looked at the tactical situation spread out before them. 9 active team members, an unknown number of opposition forces in prepared positions, and 34 minutes remaining to complete a mission that required precise coordination and adaptability. She could continue following orders that would lead to predictable failure, or she could do what 8 years of combat experience had taught her to do when conventional approaches weren't working. She chose option 3. Instead of moving toward Wilson's position as ordered, Maria began working her way around the village's eastern edge, using terrain features that the opposition force had dismissed as too difficult for rapid movement. It was a path that required crawling through drainage ditches, climbing over unstable walls, and accepting exposure to potential sniper fire in exchange for an approach angle that no one expected. For what it's worth, radio crackled with increasingly frustrated communications from her teammates. Morrison trying to coordinate a frontal assault that was being systematically dismantled by defenders who knew exactly how elite American units operated. Wilson calling for support that couldn't reach him without walking into prepared ambushes. Rodriguez attempting to provide covering fire for movements that exposed him to crossfire from multiple positions. And, through it all, Maria moved like smoke through the eastern approaches, using skills learned in a dozen countries where conventional tactics meant death and adaptation meant survival. She had been the outsider in elite units before, the one whose ideas were dismissed until results proved their value. Today would be no different, except that today the stakes were higher than personal recognition or unit acceptance. Today was about proving that sometimes the most dangerous warrior in the room was the one nobody saw coming, and that the greatest victories belonged to those willing to rewrite the rules when the old ones guaranteed failure. In 18 minutes, everything these elite soldiers thought they knew about warfare was about to change forever. Maria Santos moved through the eastern drainage system like water finding the path of least resistance. The concrete channels had been designed to handle seasonal flooding, but years of neglect had created a network of shadows and concealment that the opposition force had overlooked in their defensive planning. While her teammates engaged in the expected frontal assault, she was already inside their defensive perimeter, moving toward objectives that conventional tactics couldn't reach. The TBH first breakthrough came 12 minutes into the exercise. While Morrison's team was still trying to neutralize the sniper position that had claimed Hayes and Chen, Maria emerged from a storm drain directly beneath the building where Wilson was pinned down. The opposition fighters had positioned themselves to repel rescue attempts from the obvious approaches, but they hadn't considered that someone might come from below. Her movement was swift and silent, years of combat experience compressed into 30 seconds of lethal efficiency. The first TBH opposition fighter went down before he knew she was there. The second managed to turn toward her but found himself looking down the barrel of her weapon with nowhere to run. The third fighter, positioned to provide overwatch on Wilson's location, suddenly found his carefully planned ambush collapsing from an impossible angle. "Wilson, this is Santos," she whispered into her radio. 3 hostiles down, eastern building is clear. Move to the blue door on your left. Funny enough, Wilson's voice carried surprise and relief in equal measure. "Santos, how the hell did you get behind them?" Questions later, she replied, already moving toward her next objective. "Morrison, you've got a clear path to advance. The sniper position is exposed from the east. Rodriguez can take him from your current location." And, honestly, the change in team dynamics was immediate and dramatic. Morrison, who had been struggling with a tactical problem that seemed impossible to solve, suddenly had options. Rodriguez, who had been limited to providing ineffective covering fire, now had a clear shot at the sniper who had been controlling the battlefield. The opposition force, which had been systematically dismantling their assault, suddenly faced threats from angles they hadn't anticipated. But Maria wasn't finished. While her teammates exploited the opportunity she had created, she continued her solitary movement through the village's blind spots and forgotten spaces. The intelligence they needed to recover was located in the central building, a three-story structure that the opposition force had turned into a fortress. Every conventional approach was covered by interlocking fields of fire, and the building's interior had been rigged with training devices that would eliminate anyone who entered through predicted routes. The solution came from an unlikely source: her childhood in East Los Angeles, where she had learned to deal with urban environments in ways that military training rarely taught. The central building shared walls with adjacent structures, and those walls contained utility passages that building inspectors knew about but tactical planners often missed. Maria found the for what it's worth service entrance tucked behind a dumpster that most people would have dismissed as irrelevant terrain. The passage led to a utility room in the building's basement, which connected to a maintenance shaft that rose through all 3 floors. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't safe, and it definitely wasn't in any manual of special operations tactics. It was perfect, which she emerged into the building's 3rd floor while the opposition force was focused on defending the ground-level approaches. The intelligence, package, a sealed briefcase containing simulated classified documents, sat on a table surrounded by 3 opposition fighters who were confident that their defensive positions were impregnable. They were wrong. Maria's assault came from above, fast and unexpected. The opposition fighters had positioned themselves to repel attacks from doors and windows, not from ceiling access panels that most people didn't know existed. In less than 30 seconds, 3 experienced soldiers found themselves eliminated by someone they never saw coming, using an approach that had bypassed every defensive measure they had prepared. "Package secured," Maria announced over the radio, her voice calm despite having single-handedly neutralized half the opposition force. "All team members, rally on the central building. Mission, in my opinion, complete." The silence that followed was unlike anything she had experienced in 8 years of military service. Not the skeptical pause of morning, not the cautious evaluation of lunch conversation, but the stunned quiet of elite soldiers who had just witnessed something that challenged everything they thought they knew about warfare. Morrison was the first to respond. "Santos, confirm package recovery. How many opposition eliminated?" "Just my take." "I gotta say, 8 confirmed," Maria replied, already moving toward the building's exit. 2 remaining pretty much, somewhere in the village perimeter, but they're out of position and can't affect the primary mission. Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio next, filled with something that sounded like awe. "Jesus Christ, Santos, and where did you learn to move like that?" Before she could answer, Colonel Mitchell's voice cut through the communications. "All personnel, exercise terminated. Return to the main briefing area immediately." The walk back was unlike their morning departure. Maria found herself surrounded by teammates who looked at her with new eyes, their earlier skepticism replaced by curiosity and something approaching respect. Morrison fell into step beside her, his expression thoughtful. "That was impressive," he said quietly. "That approach through the eastern sector, where did that come from?" Maria shrugged slightly. "Experience," she replied. "Sometimes the best solution is the one nobody expects." "No," Morrison persisted. "That wasn't standard Rangers doctrine. That was something else entirely." And, honestly, Hayes, who had been eliminated early in the exercise, jogged up to join the conversation. The easy dismissiveness of morning had been replaced by genuine interest. "Santos, I have to ask, what's your real background? Because what we just saw didn't come from conventional training." The thing is, the question hung in the air as they entered the briefing room. Colonel Mitchell was waiting for them, flanked by the same observers who had documented every moment of the exercise. His expression was unreadable, the neutral mask of a senior officer who had seen enough tactical brilliance and tactical disasters to remain unimpressed by either. "Take seats," Mitchell commanded. "Plus, we need to discuss what just happened out there." The team arranged themselves around the conference table, but the dynamics had shifted completely from morning. Maria no longer sat at the edge of the group's attention, she had become the focal point around which questions and curiosity revolved. The hierarchy-based look on unit reputation and preconceived notions had been replaced by respect earned through demonstrated competence under pressure. Mitchell activated the large screen, and footage from the exercise began playing. Multiple camera angles showed the tactical situation from perspectives that revealed just how completely Maria had outmaneuvered not only the opposition force but also the limitations of her own team's conventional thinking. This exercise was designed to test how well elite units could integrate their different approaches to achieve common objectives, Mitchell began. The opposition force consisted of 12 Marine instructors who had been studying special operations tactics for 15 years. They knew how SEALs operate, how Rangers approach problems, how Delta Force conducts direct action missions. He paused the footage at the moment Maria emerged from the drainage system. What they didn't know was that one member of this team had operational experience that went far beyond their unit training. The room was completely silent. Maria could feel the attention focused on her, but it was no longer skeptical evaluation. It was the focused interest of warriors who recognized they were in the presence of something exceptional. Mitchell touched a control, and the screen changed to display a military service record. Maria's name appeared at the top, but what followed made several team members lean forward in their chairs. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, Mitchell read aloud. 8 years active duty, 6 combat deployments. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and 2 classified locations that don't appear on any official records. Funny enough, the decorations section scrolled past slowly enough for everyone to read. Bronze Star with V device for valor. Silver Star for gallantry in action. Combat Infantryman Badge, which Ranger tab? Airborne Wings. And, finally, 5 purple hearts arranged in a row that spoke of wounds received and battles survived. Purple hearts, Wilson said quietly, which 5 of them? Mitchell nodded. Awarded for wounds received in combat operations that most of you've never heard of, in support of missions. That will remain classified for the next 50 years. The screen changed again, showing a map of Afghanistan with several locations marked in red. October 2019, Helmand Province. Sergeant Santos led a 12-man team on a personnel recovery mission when their helicopter was shot down behind enemy lines. She carried 3 wounded soldiers 18 miles through hostile territory while being pursued by Taliban fighters. When they reached the extraction point, she refused medical evacuation until all her teammates were safely aboard the rescue aircraft. Hayes stared at the screen. That was the story she told at lunch. But she didn't mention the part about being wounded herself. Shrapnel in her left shoulder and a bullet wound in her leg, Mitchell confirmed. She, for what it's worth, completed the mission before accepting medical treatment. The next slide showed a different map, this one of Iraq. March 2020, outside Baghdad. Sergeant Santos was embedded with a joint task force targeting a high-value individual who was coordinating attacks against American forces. When the primary assault team was pinned down by superior numbers, she conducted a solo infiltration through enemy positions. Eliminated 6 hostile fighters from an impossible angle, allowing the mission to succeed. Maria watched her teammates' faces as the briefing continued. The skepticism of morning had been completely replaced by something approaching reverence. These were soldiers who understood exactly what the words on that screen represented, not just individual acts of courage, but a level of tactical brilliance that separated the truly exceptional from even the very good. December 2021, classified location, Mitchell continued. Sergeant Santos volunteered for a mission that required infiltrating a terrorist stronghold to recover captured American personnel. The operation lasted honestly 4 days, during which she operated alone behind enemy lines, evaded capture multiple times, and ultimately secured the safe extraction of 3 American hostages who had been held for 8 months. Rodriguez shook his head slowly. 4 days alone in hostile territory. How do you even train for something like that? You don't train for it, Mitchell replied. You discover you're capable of it when everything else has failed and American lives depend on what you do next. The final slide showed the Silver Star citation, and Mitchell read it aloud in its entirety. The language was formal and bureaucratic, but it couldn't disguise the extraordinary nature of what it described. A single soldier, cut off from support, facing impossible odds, refusing to give up when surrender would have been understandable and retreat would have been tactical wisdom. When Mitchell finished reading, the room remained silent for long moments. These were men who had earned their own decorations for valor, who had faced their own impossible situations and emerged victorious. But what they had just heard was something beyond their experience, a level of sustained excellence under pressure that few warriors ever achieved. Chen was the first to speak. "Why didn't you mention any of this before?" Maria met his gaze directly. "Because it wasn't relevant to the mission," she replied simply. "Past performance doesn't guarantee future results. What matters is what we can accomplish as a team." Morrison leaned back in his chair, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and respect. "Santos, I owe you an apology. We all do. We made assumptions based on things that don't matter instead of waiting to see what kind of soldier you actually are." "No apology necessary," Maria replied. "First impressions are natural. I've learned to let my work speak for itself, honestly." Hayes nodded slowly. "Well, your work just spoke pretty damn loudly. That tactical approach you used, where did you learn to think like that?" Maria was quiet. For a moment, considering how to answer a question that touched on experiences most people couldn't comprehend. "You learn to adapt when conventional approaches get people killed," she finally said. "After enough missions where the textbook solution doesn't work, you start writing your own textbook." The thing is, the conversation that followed was unlike anything from earlier in the day. Instead of polite skepticism and veiled challenges, her teammates asked genuine questions about tactical approaches, combat experiences, and the kind of decision-making that separated survivors from casualties in the world's most dangerous places. But, more importantly, the team dynamics had fundamentally shifted. The hierarchy based on unit reputation and preconceived notions had been replaced by recognition of demonstrated capability. When they discussed the next day's training schedule, Morrison automatically included Maria in the planning process. When Hayes mentioned concerns about equipment testing procedures, he directed the question to her as naturally as he would to any other team member. The transformation was complete by evening, when the team gathered for dinner in the facility's dining room. Maria found herself at the center of conversations rather than on the periphery, her opinions sought on everything from tactical modifications to equipment improvements. The easy camaraderie that had excluded her in the morning now embraced her as naturally as if she had been part of the group for years. But perhaps the most telling moment came when Rodriguez raised his coffee cup in an informal toast. "To learning something new every day," he said, his eyes meeting Maria's across the table. "And to never underestimating a warrior based on anything except their actions under fire." 11 cups rose in response, held by men who had learned that true strength came in forms they hadn't expected, and that the greatest warriors were sometimes the ones you'd never see coming until it was too late to do anything except respect what they could accomplish. Maria raised her own cup, accepting the recognition that her performance had earned while knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove herself. The 5 purple hearts on her service record weren't just decorations, they were proof that she had been tested in the crucible of combat and emerged stronger each time. The SEALs had scoffed at the new recruit. Now they knew better. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room was the quiet one sitting in the corner, waiting for the moment when actions would speak louder than assumptions ever could.